One might argue that if Corvandre had simply said her name, none of it would ever have happened, but then again, if the woman had waited 3 heartbeats longer at the door, he would have said it. So really, when one thinks about it carefully, the whole ruinous business was nobody's fault at all, which is, as anyone who has ever lost something will tell you, the very worst kind of fault there is. Maren Vale had been summoned to the great hall of Vardenhold twice in her life. The first time she was 11 years old and small enough to hide behind a pillar, and a man with grey at his temples put a hand on her shoulder and told the steward that this one could read, and that she was to be given a bed and a candle and a place among the rolls. The second time was tonight. She stood at the foot of the dais in a clerk's grey wool, with ink still under her fingernails, because nobody had told her why she was wanted, and she had assumed, the way she always assumed, that somebody upstairs had misplaced a treaty and needed a woman who knew where it lived. It was, as far as she had ever been told, the only remarkable thing about her. The hall was full. That was the first thing that was wrong. 200 of the great houses of Vardenhold stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the banners, and every single one of them was looking at her, and Maren had the sudden airless understanding that she was not here about a treaty. At the top of the dais, the Alpha King of Vardenhold sat with one hand curled around the arm of his father's chair, and did not look at her at all. 11 days ago, in a cold corridor outside the muniment room, Corvandre had walked past her with an armful of maps, and stopped so abruptly that he dropped every one of them. She had knelt to help him gather them. He had not moved. And when she looked up, he was staring down at her with an expression she had never seen on a king or on any other man, and something under her ribs had reached out and taken hold of something under his, faded. The thing the old women in the poorhouse used to talk about to keep warm. For 11 days, she had carried it like a coal in her mouth. He had come to the archive 4 nights running, and sat on the window ledge with his boots up like a boy, and asked her what she was copying, and listened to the answer as though it mattered. On the 4th night, he had touched the back of her hand with 2 fingers and told her that he had never in his life wanted to keep anything, and that he wanted to keep her, and that he did not yet know what to do about it. Now she stood in the great hall and understood that he had decided. "My lords," said Bevanlock. The Lord Chancellor came forward with a paper in his hand, and Maren felt her heart do something small and confused, because Bevan had raised her. Bevan had taught her the difference between a true seal and a false one. He did not look at her either. "There has been talk," Bevan said, "of a bond, of a fated bond between our king and a woman of no name. I would have let the talk die quietly, but talk of that kind does not die, it rots. And so I bring the court the truth of it, and I do it here, in the open, where nobody can say afterwards that we hid a thing." He held up the paper. "This woman was placed in the palace of Vardenhold by the crown of Selenen 9 years ago, to sit among our treaties and read them, and to send south what she read." The hall made a sound like water going out. "The bond is a fabrication," Bevan said, "a working. It was made to reach a young king through the one door he keeps unlocked, which is his loneliness. My lords, I have been a fool. I brought this girl in myself. I gave her the key to the room where we keep our promises." Maren heard all of it. She also, at the same time, quite calmly, saw the flaw. The seal was Solanese, and it was a good forgery. But Selena had changed the wax in the 2nd year of Ansel's reign, from red to brown, and this seal was red, and the letter was dated after the change, and any clerk who had spent 9 years with her nose in the treaty rolls of 2 kingdoms could have told him so. She opened her mouth to say it, and then she looked up at the dais. Corvandre had gone the color of ash. He had been ill for weeks. She had noticed it in the corridor, in the archive, in the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence and had to find his way back to it. He was gripping the arm of the chair so hard she could see the white of his knuckles from the floor, and his mouth was slightly open, as though he had begun a sentence somewhere and never finished it. "Your Majesty," said Bevan gently, "is this woman your mate?" And Corvandre said nothing. Maren waited. She was aware afterwards that she had waited a very long time, long enough for the wax on the candles to gutter, long enough for Lady Senet of Ostmere, who had been promised the throne since she was 14, to smile behind her hand. He did not say yes, he did not say no, he did not say her name. And something in Marin, which had spent 11 days being cautiously, foolishly, unbearably happy, put its head down and understood. She did not cry, because she was not going to give them that. She reached up instead and pulled the pin out of her collar, the small tarnished pin of an archivist of Vardenhold, which Bevan Locke had given her when she was 11, and which she had worn every day since. She closed her fist around it and said, the old words the women in the poorhouse used to say. The ones for a bond refused. Freely made, she said. Freely, unmade. I take it back. The hall went silent. It is a small right. You give back the thing that gave you your place and you go, so that you do not spend the rest of your life feeling him breathe. She opened her hand and let the pin fall. It rang on the flagstone. It rolled. It stopped. And Marin Vale stood in that hall with an empty fist and felt absolutely nothing at all. Then she turned around, and she walked the whole long length of that hall, past every noble house in the kingdom, without hurrying. Behind her, at the very last moment, she heard a chair scrape, she heard him stand, she heard him draw a breath, the way a man draws a breath when he has finally, far too late, found the word he was looking for. And then the great doors of Vardenhold closed behind her, and whatever it was that the Alpha King said to her that night, Marin Vale did not hear a single syllable of it. She never asked. For 1 year, she never asked. Selene in summer smelled of cut hay and hot stone, and Marin had learned to love it the way you learn to love a room you did not choose. She had walked south with nothing. That was not a figure of speech. She had walked 19 days, slept in barns, and arrived at the border post of Selene with her boots in her hand, asking for work as a clerk. What she got instead was a king. Ansel came down to the border post himself, because a woman had turned up at his gate, claiming to be the archivist of the Vardenhold Treaty Rolls, and he was the sort of man who found that far more interesting than a war. He sat across a plank table from her in a guardhouse, in his shirt sleeves, with a cup of bad tea, and asked her one question. The grain tithe of the Northern March, he had said. Which article? The 11th, Marin said. And it is wrong. It has been wrong since your grandfather signed it. You are paying twice for the same road. Ansel had put down his tea. That was the beginning. Now, a year on, she stood at the window of a chamber too large for her and watched them load the carriages in the yard below, while Nessa did something merciless with her hair. Cold still. I am holding still. You are vibrating, said Nessa, like a struck bell. The crown was on the table. She had worn it perhaps a dozen times and still had not got used to the fact that it did not feel like a costume, which was somehow worse than if it had. You do not have to go, Nessa said more quietly. He would not make you go. I know he would not. Then say the word, and I will tell them you have a fever. Marin looked down at the yard. 40 riders. The banners of Selene, hanging limp in the heat. The article that beggars our northern march is the same article that beggars theirs. Vardenhold has been bleeding grain for 9 years, and nobody in that palace can read well enough to find out why, and I have spent a year learning exactly how to fix it. She picked up the crown and set it on her own head without ceremony. The way you put on a hat. I am not going to sit in a warm room in the south and let the people I grew up with starve because I am frightened of a man. Nessa was quiet for a moment. Are you frightened of him? No, said Marin. It was even true. That was the strangest part. She had braced for the grief every morning of that first year the way you brace for a blow, and it had simply never come, and the place where he had been stayed quiet. And after a while, she stopped checking. She was not brave. She was empty. She had made her peace with the difference. Then why, said Nessa, have you changed your gown 4 times? Marin did not dignify that. They rode north for 9 days. She had crossed that border once with her boots in her hand. She crossed it now at the head of a column, and on the 8th day, she saw that the fields on the Vardenhold side were thin and yellow and wrong, and she stopped the column and knelt in the dirt and put her hand in it, and Amsel, riding up, did not ask her what she was doing. "Bad?" he said. "It has been bad for years." She rubbed the soil between her fingers. "Whoever is robbing that treasury is not taking gold. Gold gets counted. They're taking the thing nobody counts." Ansel looked out at the yellow fields for a long moment. "Marin, when we get there, if he says anything to you at all, he will not." "If he does," said Ansel, "you have only to look at me." She did not answer because they were already in sight of the towers, and because there was nothing to say to it that was not enormous. The great hall of Vardenhold has one door. It is very tall, and it takes 2 men to open each side of it, and when it opens, it makes a low grinding sound, like a stone being rolled off a tomb. Marin Vale had walked out of that door 1 year ago with an empty fist, a dropped pin ringing on the stone behind her, and nothing to her name. "Her Majesty," the herald bellowed, "Marin, Queen of Selene," and the doors ground open. The thing nobody tells you about a crown is that it is a lever. Marin walked into that hall and felt the room take her weight and shift, and she understood, in the space of 4 steps, exactly what she had become. She was no longer a clerk in grey wool, who could be discussed. She was the wife of a king with 40 riders in the yard, and a treaty in his saddlebag, and every one of those 200 faces that had watched her walk out was now obliged, by law and by custom, and by simple, naked fear, to bow. They bowed. Lady Senate of Ostmere bowed lowest of all, and Marin, walking past her, thought with great clarity that she had not known she was capable of enjoying anything so much. Then she reached the dais and made herself look up. Corvandre was thinner. That was the first thing, and it landed low and unfairly, and she had no defense prepared for it. He was a big man, and he had been carved out somewhere in the last year, and the fine bones of his face were doing something. The fine bones of his face had no business doing. He was in black. He was standing, which he had not been the last time, and he was looking at her with the total arrested, undefended attention of a man watching a door open in a wall. He had spent a year convincing himself was solid. Marin felt nothing. She noted this with savage satisfaction, the way you might note that a wound has finally scabbed. Whatever this was, this heat behind her sternum, this appalling awareness of the exact distance between them, was not a bond. It was memory, and memory was a thing a disciplined woman could simply refuse to look at. "Your Majesty," said Ansel warmly beside her, and put out his hand. Corvin did not take it. "For one beat too long, Selene," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered. "You are welcome, in Vardenhold. We are glad of it. May I present my wife?" And there it was. Marin watched the word go into him. She had spent a year telling herself she would feel nothing, and she felt something then, and what she felt, to her lasting shame, was not triumph. "Your Majesty," she said, and she inclined her head precisely as far as protocol required, and not one hair further. Corvandre opened his mouth. "My lady," said Bevanlock. The Chancellor came down the dais steps, with both hands out, and a smile of such warmth and such grief, that for one lurching second, Marin was 11 years old again, and holding a candle. "Queen, Marin, you will forgive an old man his feelings. I have prayed for a year that you were alive." "I was alive," said Marin. "So I see." His eyes were wet. They were genuinely wet, and that was the thing about Bevanlock, that she had never once been able to get behind. "Then, let us have the difficult thing out in the open, where nobody can say afterwards that we hid it." He turned to the room. He had a very good voice. He had taught her to read with that voice. "A year ago, this court was told that a bond existed between our king and a clerk of the archive. If that were true, this lady's marriage is a mockery, and this treaty is a fraud, and every man here knows it. So, let it be said aloud and be done." He turned. "Your Majesty, before the court of Vardenhold and the crown of Selene, was there ever a bond between you and this woman?" Marin stood very still. It was, she thought distantly, a perfect trap. If Corvin said yes, then she was a bonded woman married to another king, and Selene would have to repudiate her before nightfall, and the treaty would burn, and Ansel would be dragged into a war he could not win. If he said no, he unmade her in front of everybody for the second time. In the same room, in exactly the same way, Corvindre looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment, and Marin, who had spent 9 years learning to read a false seal, could not read his face at all. There was no bond, he said. The hall exhaled. There was never a bond, Corvin said, louder, and every word came out flat and clean and final, like nails going into wood. There was a fabrication, and a foolish young king and a clerk who had no part in it. Queen Marin of Selene is bound to Selene alone. I will kill the man who says otherwise in my hearing. Bevan bowed his head. Then it is finished, he said, and gladly, and that should have been the end of it. Marin turned away with her face composed and let Ansel take her arm, and thought, with a hard, cold satisfaction that lasted almost 20 steps, that at least now they were even. Then she stopped. A year ago, in this hall, Corvindre had been asked whether she was his mate and had said nothing at all. He had been unable to speak. She had watched him grip the arm of that chair like a drowning man and failed to produce a single word. Tonight he had produced a whole speech, and every word of it had been rehearsed. Nobody rehearses the truth. Marin stood in the middle of the great hall of Vardenhold with a crown on her head and felt the first cold finger of doubt go down her spine. He was lying. The question was what a man gains by lying about the one thing that has already cost him everything he had. The muniment room of Vardenhold had not been cleaned in a year, and Marin knew that the moment she opened the door, because it smelled exactly as she had left it. You cannot go in there, said the young guard at her shoulder, and then remembered what she was, and went the color of a boiled prawn. Your Majesty, forgive me, nobody goes in there. The king's order. Marin stood in the doorway of the room, where she had spent 9 years of her life, and looked at the ledgers stacked exactly where she had stacked them, and the stub of her own candle in its dish, and the chair pushed back from the desk at the angle a person leaves a chair when they expect to come back in an hour. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had been allowed to. She discovered she could not speak for a moment, and covered it by walking in. Your Majesty, the guard said desperately. Go and tell the Lord Chancellor that the Queen of Solena is auditing the grain tithe, and that if he wishes to prevent her, he is very welcome to come and try. The guard fled. She had 4 hours before anybody senior enough to stop her, worked out where she was, and she did not waste them. She took the treasury rolls, and the requisition books, and the shipping manifests of the Northern March, and she laid them side by side down the length of the table and began to read. It took her 90 minutes to find it. It was not a clever theft. That was the astonishing thing. Somebody had simply been writing the same grain shipment into the ledger twice, once as delivered to the Northern March and once as delivered to the Crown stores, and drawing payment for both. And because grain rots and nobody weighs a rotted sack, nobody had ever put the 2 books on the same table. One lived in the treasury and one lived in the archive, and only one man in Vardenhold had ever held the keys to both. Marin sat back very slowly. You found it in an afternoon, said Corvindre from the doorway. She did not turn around. She had known he was there for perhaps a minute. Not by any bond, she told herself firmly. By the fact that the room had gone quiet in a particular way. An afternoon and 9 years, she said. How long have you known? Now, she did turn. He was leaning in the doorway, with his arms folded and his coat off, and he looked exhausted in a way she had not let herself see across the width of a great hall. There was ink on his hands. You have been doing this yourself, she said slowly. At night, 'cause you cannot trust the clerks. I cannot trust the clerks, Corvin agreed. Because the man who appoints the clerks is the man who is robbing me. Yes, then arrest him. On what? He came into the room, but not close. He stopped at the far end of the long table, which she noticed and was grateful for, and which annoyed her intensely. Bevanlock has held this kingdom together since my father died. He holds the treasury, the courts, and the loyalty of every great house in the north. If I take him without proof that a stone would accept, there is blood in the streets by morning, and Solene has a war on its border whether it wants one or not. His jaw worked. Tyrants arrest whoever frightens them. Then they wonder about the knife. It was, Marin thought bitterly, such a good answer that she wanted to throw a ledger at him. "Show me the seed grain," she said instead. He blinked. "What?" "It is not in these books, which means it is taken before it is ever written down." She pulled the manifest towards her. "Gold is counted. Grain is counted. Seed corn is a farmer's business, and nobody in a palace has ever once looked at it. That is what is being stolen, and that is why your fields are yellow, and that is why nothing you have found adds up to enough to hang him." She looked up. "You are looking for a theft. You should be looking for a famine." Corvindre stood very still. Then he crossed the room and pulled out the chair beside her and sat down and said, "Show me." So she showed him. She had meant to be cold. She had rehearsed being cold for 9 days on the road. But the tally rolls were open, and the man beside her was asking the right questions faster than she could answer them. And at some point she stopped noticing that he was a king and started noticing only that he was quick. "Here," he said, 3 hours later, with his finger on a line. "That is the same wagon on 2 roads on the same day." "Yes," he laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him. And it was the first sound of joy she had heard in that palace in a year, and it went through her like a nail. "Gods," he said, "you are terrifying. I am a clerk. You are the most dangerous person in this building, and you have ink on your nose." His hand came up without thought, the way a hand comes up when it has done a thing 100 times before, and she felt his thumb brush the bridge of her nose, and both of them stopped breathing at the same moment. He took his hand back. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "It is nothing. It is not nothing." And then she smelled it. Lamp oil, which was correct, because there were 4 lamps burning. But lamp oil is a thin smell, and this was thick, and it was coming from under the door, and the muniment room of Vardenhold does not keep its oil in the corridor. Marin was moving before she had finished the thought. The door was barred from the outside. She hit it once with her shoulder and it did not give, and by then the smoke was coming under it in a gray rope, and Corvin was staring at the wall of ledgers that lined that room floor to ceiling, 9 years of dry paper, and understanding exactly how much time they had. "The coal chute," Marin said. "There is no coal chute. There is, because I have been putting my hand up it to hide my dinner from the archivist for 9 years, and it comes out in the west yard." She was already dragging the reading table towards the wall. "Help me," he helped her. They came out into the west yard on their hands and knees, in the dark, coughing, filthy, with the ledger of the Northern March clutched to her chest, because she had refused to leave it, and behind them, the archive of Vardenhold was going up like a lantern. Marin rolled onto her back on the cold flagstones and did the arithmetic. Somebody had barred that door within the last 4 hours. Somebody had known she was in there and had decided, inside an hour, that a clerk with a crown was worth more dead than the entire Treaty of Solene. She turned her head. Corvindre was sitting up beside her with his forearms on his knees, watching his archive burn, and his face was grim and set and absolutely unastonished. "You are not surprised," said Marin. "No, Corvin." His name came out before she could stop it, and it was the first time in a year, and she saw it land on him. "How many times has someone tried to kill you?" And Corvin looked at the fire and said, "This month?" Somewhere above them, a beam went, and the whole west face of the archive came down into itself in a rush of sparks, and the bells began to ring across the sleeping city. She had come north to fix a treaty. She was going to have to fix something considerably worse. They gave her a chamber in the East Tower with a good lock, and Marin spent the next 3 weeks doing what she was best at, which was reading. What she was not doing, she told herself, was thinking about Corvindre. She thought about him constantly. It was infuriating. She was a married queen of 28, with a treaty to save, and a chancellor to hang, and instead, she was lying awake in the dark cataloging, the way he had said "forgive me" in the archive, low and rough, as though the words hurt him on the way out. So she did what any sensible woman does with an inconvenient feeling. She turned it into work. She began, quite deliberately, to investigate him, because there was something wrong with the man, and it was not grief. He was ill. Some mornings he was the fastest mind in the room, and some afternoons she watched him lose the thread of a sentence halfway through and go gray and cover it with a joke, and nobody at that council table said a word about it, which told her that everybody at that table had learned not to. She started keeping a note, in a hand so small it looked like a pattern, in the margin of a book of tithes nobody had opened since the reign of his grandfather. The dates, the hours, what he drank, who poured it. It was on the 10th day that she noticed he was always worst in the evening, always after council, and that at every council, there was a jug of the black tea of the north on the table, and only one man ever poured it. Bevan Locke poured for everybody. He had poured for her when she was a girl. Marin felt something very cold walk up her arms. She did not go to Corvin. She went to Nessa, and Nessa found her a physician's herbal out of the Solanese baggage, and Marin read it from cover to cover in a single night. And on the 9th page she found a root called wolfspine, which is not a poison at all. Wolfspine does not kill, it dulls. It was used in the old wars on captured alphas, because a man who cannot hear his own instincts will hesitate at the exact moment he most needs to move. It is very slow. It takes months to build. And the first thing it takes, said the herbal, in a dry, marginal note, written some 200 years ago, is a new bond. An unclaimed bond is a thread, and a thread goes quiet under the drug, the way a candle goes out under a hand. Marin put the book down and looked at the wall for a very long time. He had been sitting on that dais a year ago, with the stuff in his blood, gripping the arm of that chair like a drowning man, and he had been asked in front of 200 witnesses whether the woman on the floor of his hall was his mate, and he had not been able to feel her. She discovered that her hands were shaking and put them flat on the table until they stopped, because there were 2 ways to read it, and she had a whole year of hating him invested in the second. Either he had said nothing because he could not feel her, or he had said nothing because he did not want her, and the drug was a convenient excuse that a foolish woman with an old wound might reach for, and she would rather burn than be that woman. She found him at midnight, in the ruin of the archive, going through the ash, with his boot by lantern light, and he did not turn around when she came in, and she understood from the set of his shoulders that he had known it was her from the moment she crossed the yard. "You should not be here," he said. "Neither should you. It is my building. It was my life," said Marin, and he flinched. She came and stood beside him in the ash. "I want you to tell me why you lied," she said. "I did not lie. You stood in your own hall and swore there was never a bond, and every word of it was rehearsed." She turned and looked at him. "You were never a good liar, Corvin Dre. And I will tell you how I know. A year ago, in that same room, you could not produce a single word, and a man who cannot lie under pressure does not suddenly become fluent unless somebody has written it out for him first." Corvin closed his eyes. "Ask me tomorrow," he said. "No, Marin, do not." It came out of her like a whip crack. "Do not say my name as though you have any right to it. You did not say it when it would have cost you something. You do not get to say it now that it is free." The lantern hissed, and then he turned around, and the look on his face stopped the breath in her throat, because there was nothing on it. No charm, no crown, no defense. Just a man who had been holding something up with both arms for a year and had run out of arms, because if I had said yes, he said, very quietly, you would have been dead within the month. Bevan had already written the warrant. I saw it on his desk, spy, working, execution, all of it drawn up and waiting on a word from me, and the only thing keeping you alive was that I had not yet claimed you. Marin stared at him. "So I let you go," he said. "And I have hated myself for 365 days, for how well it worked. You should have told me. I could not reach you. You were gone in a night. You went south with nothing and you married a king inside 4 months. And by the time I knew where you were his. You could have written and said what?" He laughed, and it was awful. "Forgive me for the public humiliation. I did it out of love. Please do not tell anyone. There is no letter, Marin. I sat down to write it 100 times, and every version ended with you dead in a cell, so I burned them. And I let you hate me, because a woman who hates a man is not a woman he is bonded to. And while Bevan believed that, he left you alone. She could not speak. And then you walked back through my door with a crown on your head and 40 riders in the yard. And do you know what I felt when the herald said your name? I felt afraid. Because you had come back into the one room I could not keep you out of. The lantern guttered. Marin was aware distantly that she had crossed the floor. She did not remember deciding to. She was close enough to see the ash on his throat, and he was looking down at her with his whole ruined heart in his face. And she was a married woman standing in the ruin of her life at midnight, and there was nothing left in her that wanted to be sensible. His hand came up and stopped short of her jaw. Tell me to stop, he said roughly. Say one word, and I will never speak of it again as long as I live, and I will hand you back to Selene with my own hands, and I will never once look at you across a table for the rest of my life. Say it. Marin opened her mouth. And she thought, with awful clarity, of Ansel of Solène, who had put a cup of bad tea in front of her in a guardhouse, and asked her about the 11th article, who had given her a name, and a crown, and a country, who had said, on the road north, you have only to look at me. She stepped back. Stop, she said. Corvin Dray let his hand fall. Then it is stopped, he said. He turned away, and he picked up the lantern, and he began to walk out of the ruin of the archive, and Marin stood in the ash with her fists closed, and let him get 5 paces before she broke. I never stopped, she said. He went absolutely still. That is what you want to hear, so have it. I never stopped. Not on the road, not in Solène, not for a single hour of an entire year. Her voice cracked straight down the middle and she let it. But I cut it, Corvin. I cut it myself in front of your whole court, with a pin out of my collar, and it is gone, and I would not give it to you if I had it, because I am another man's wife, and he is a better man than either of us. The silence went on a long time. Then Corvin turned around, and the lantern light caught his face, and Marin saw that he was looking at her with an expression of dawning and absolute horror. Marin, he said, what do you mean it is gone? I told you I severed it. You severed it, he repeated. Yes. You cut the bond, and it went quiet, and you have felt nothing for a year. He was very white, and you assumed that meant it was dead. Corvin, she said, what are you saying? And Corvin Dray said, I have felt you every single day. That is not possible. Marin, it is not possible. She was backing away from him, across the ash, and could not seem to stop. I cut it. I stood in front of 200 people and I threw down my own pin and I said the words, and I have felt nothing since. Nothing. I waited for it to hurt. I waited every morning for a month, for the grief to come and find me, and it never came, and in the end I decided that meant it had never been real, that I had made a fool of myself over a thing I invented. I built a whole year out of that. Corvin, I know, he said. You do not know. You did not sleep for the first 4 nights, said Corvin Dray. On the 5th, you had a fever in a barn with rain coming through the roof, and in the middle of that night you got up and started walking north again, back towards me. And then you stopped in the road and stood there a long time and turned around and went south. Marin stopped moving. You have never told anybody that. And I lay on the floor of my own bedchamber, 300 miles away, with my fist in my mouth, praying you would keep walking north, and knowing I had made absolutely certain you would not. The right, Marin whispered. It did not take. No, it always takes. Freely made, freely unmade, freely made, Corvin repeated. By both. A bond is a thing 2 people say yes to, and a thing 2 people have to say no to. And I never said no. He looked at her. I never said anything at all. That is the entire crime, and you have been living in the middle of it for a year, and you thought it was mercy. She put her hand against the blackened wall to hold herself up. So I am not severed. You are shut, he said. You closed a door. You did not burn a house. Then open it. No, open it. If I open it, you will feel everything I have felt every day for a year, and I will not survive watching that go into your face. His voice was fraying. You have a husband. You have a crown. You built a life out of your own bones, and I will not take it apart with my hands, because I want something. She crossed the floor and took his wrist. You have never once, she said, let me decide anything. And she put his hand flat against her sternum, over the place where the door was, and she opened it. It went through her like a river through a wall, not a memory of a year. The year itself, arriving all at once, dense and hot and unsorted, grief first, so bottomless she could not find the floor of it. Then a rage turned so far inward it had gone quiet, the way of fire goes quiet when it has finished with the fuel. Then, underneath all of it, patient and ordinary and unbearable, the plain fact of him wanting her, without hope, on a Tuesday in a corridor for a year. And then something else. Something slow and swimming and drowsy that did not belong there at all, old and thick and heavy, pulling him down the way water pulls down a swimmer who has stopped believing in the shore. Marin wrenched her hand back and stared at him. How long? She said. Have you been drinking Bevan's tea? Corvin blinked at her. What? The black tea of the north. At council, he has always poured it. He poured it for me when I was a girl and could not sleep. Her voice was climbing, and she could not get it down. How long, Corvin? Since my father died, he said slowly. Since I was 19, Marin. What is this? Wolf-spined, said Marin. She watched him understand. They used it on captured alphas in the old wars. It takes months to build. And the first thing it takes is a new bond. He stood in the ruin of his archive and did not move at all. Then how? She said, and her voice was not steady. Have you felt me for a year? Because by then, it was not new. He looked at his own hands. An unclaimed bond is a thread. That is what the drug is for. It puts out a thread. But you did not leave me a thread, Marin. You stood on that floor and you took yourself back and left me a wound. And there is not enough poison in the north to make a man stop feeling that. A year ago you sat on that dais and were asked whether I was your mate, and you could not answer. And I have spent every day since hating you for the pause. She was shaking. You were not choosing. Corvin, you could not feel me. He made certain you could not feel me, and then he asked you the question in front of the entire kingdom. The lantern flame stood straight up in the dark. No, said Corvin. It is in your blood. I felt it. No, he said again, and his voice was terrible. Do not hand me that. Do not you dare hand me that. She had come prepared for grief, or fury, or the slow collapse of a man learning what has been done to him. She was not prepared for the way he turned on her. I knew what I was doing, he said. I was slow and I was sick, and I was frightened, and I have gone over that night 10,000 times, and I could have said your name. It would have cost me the north and the crown, and possibly my life, and I could have opened my mouth and said Marin, and I did not. His fists were closed. So you will not hand me a reason, and let me put my guilt down. I lost you. I did it. And if I am allowed to blame a cup of tea for it, then I never have to look at the thing in me that hesitated, and I will not be a man who does that. Marin stood in the ash, and felt the last, load-bearing wall of her hatred come down. You impossible man, she said unsteadily. You are being poisoned. Then we will hang the man who is doing it, he said, and I will still have hesitated. 2 days later they signed the treaty. It was done in the long gallery, and Bevan Locke was radiant. He had drafted half the articles. He shook Ansel's hand with both of his. He praised the Queen of Solène, at length, for her diligence with the grain rolls, and the hall applauded, and Marin stood there, with her hands folded and thought, quite calmly, that she was going to take him apart. Then the cups came round for the oath, 2 of them, on a tray, dark wine, 1 for each king. Bevan took the tray himself from the steward, because Bevan always poured, and Marin stood there with her hands folded and did nothing. She thought about it in the 2 heartbeats. It took him to cross the floor, and she ran it all the way to the end, the way she had been taught. If she stopped that tray, she accused the Lord Chancellor of Vardenhold of poisoning, in front of the entire court, with a herbal and a hunch and no proof that a stone would accept. He would smile, he would be believed. And every ledger she had not yet copied would be in a brazier by nightfall, so she waited. She would take him apart properly, with paper, in a month, the way it had to be done. She would think about those 2 heartbeats for the rest of her life. Ansel drank. Corvin drank. Nothing happened. Nothing happened all afternoon, and nothing in the evening. And Marin, standing at the window of the East Tower with her heart slamming, allowed herself to believe she had been wrong, that she had made a monster out of a grieving old man because she needed the last year to be somebody else's fault. Then, near midnight, the door of her chamber came open without a knock. Nessa was white to the lips. "It is King Ansel," she said. "He is on the floor of his chamber and he cannot speak, and he cannot lift his head." The physician of Vardenhold said it was apoplexy, and Marin told him that if he used that word in her hearing again, she would have him removed from the room, and the physician decided that a second opinion might after all be valuable. Ansel lay in the great bed, with his eyes open. He knew her. That was the worst of it. His right hand moved when she took it, and he could not make a single word come out of his mouth, and his gaze followed her around that room with a patience that broke her in half. She sent for the Solanese physician, who had ridden north with them, and she sent him in ahead of the men of Vardenhold, and she stood over him while he worked. She sat on the edge of that bed at 2 a.m, with his hand in both of hers, and said, "You will not die. I forbid it. You are the only man in either kingdom who has ever asked me a sensible question, and you will not die of a cup of wine." Ansel's fingers moved against her palm. Then she went to find her husband's papers, because she had a very cold idea about who had suggested this journey in the first place. The door of Ansel's study was already open. Corvin Dre was standing behind her husband's desk, with the drawers pulled out and a sheaf of Solanese correspondence in his hand. Marin stopped in the doorway. Neither of them moved. She watched him understand exactly what this looked like. She watched him not put the papers down. "Marin," he said, "this is not what you think." "My husband," said Marin, very quietly, "is lying in a room 40 paces from here, and cannot say his own name. And I have come to look at his letters, and you are already here. Yes, say something better than yes." "I cannot, because it is the truth, and I have been in this room 3 times before tonight." The floor tilted very gently. 3 times since the day you arrived. He came around the desk, but not near her, and set the papers down squarely, like a man laying down a weapon. Quote, "Listen to me, and then hate me, but listen first. The letter Bevan produced in that hall a year ago carried a Solanese seal. It was forged. I saw it. The wax was the wrong color. It was red, and it should have been brown. I could have proved it in a moment, if anybody in that room had been willing to hear a clerk. I know it was forged," he said. "That is not the question. The question is, who gave Bevan Locke a Solanese seal in the first place? And the answer is that somebody in the court of Solene has been writing to my chancellor for 9 years." Marin did not move. "You are going to say, Ansel, I am going to say that money has gone out of my treasury for 9 years, and it has not stayed in Vardenhold. It goes to House Ostmere, and out of House Ostmere it goes south, and it crosses at the border post, and there is a name on the ledger. There, and I would give my right hand for it not to be the name that it is. Say it." "The crown of Solene," said Corvin. "You are standing in the study of a man who cannot lift a cup," Marin said, and let her voice rise, "and telling me he has been buying your kingdom for 9 years, and you cannot even give me a name." "I can give you a question," said Corvin, and something in the way he said it stopped her because he did not want to ask it. She could see that he did not want to ask it. He looked like a man about to put his hand into a fire. "Marin," he said, "a year ago you walked out of that hall with nothing. No money, no horse, no friends, no plan. You are the most prepared person I have ever met in my life, and you walked into a night with nothing. Who told you to go south?" The room went very quiet. "Nobody told me to go south." "Think." I went south because it was south, because it was away, because there was nowhere else. Her mouth had gone dry. Because Selene keeps the only other archive of the treaty rolls in the world, and I am a clerk, and it was the only place on the earth where what I am is worth anything. And who, said Corvindre gently, taught you that? And Marin stood in the doorway of her husband's study and heard it, not as a memory, as a voice. Bevanlock, standing behind a small girl in the archive with his hand on her shoulder, sang in that beautiful, patient voice that there was only one other place in the world that kept rolls like these, and that it was in the South, and that a woman who could read them would never in her life go hungry there. He had put it in her the way you put a coin in a purse, and he had waited, and, on the worst night of her life, she had reached into herself for a direction and pulled out his. No, she said. Marin. No, because if that is true, then he did not throw me out of this kingdom. She was gripping the doorframe. He posted me. He looked at a girl he raised, and he saw a thing he could use twice, and he used me here for 9 years, and then he sent me south and used me there, and the only reason I have a crown on my head is that he wanted a friend in Ansel's bed. I do not know that, Corvin said. I have not been able to find out. I have been sitting in this palace for 3 weeks, with the woman I love under my roof, unable to ask her a single question, because every road I follow leads back to her husband. So you searched his runes? Yes. And the entire time, said Marin, you thought I might be his. No, it came out of him like something torn. You are the one person in either kingdom I cleared before I had a shred of evidence. And do you want to know why? Because you severed a bond in front of 200 witnesses, rather than stand 1 more hour in a room with a man who would not claim you. Nobody running a 9-year deception throws down her own collar pin in front of the court out of pride. He was breathing hard. You are the only honest thing I have. Then, why did you not tell me? Because you would have defended him, said Corvin. And you would have gone straight to Ansel, and Ansel would have known within the hour. And if Ansel is the man at the end of this, then you would be dead. And if he is not, he said, and his voice finally went, then I would have taught you to distrust the one man on this earth who has been kind to you, and I would have done it for nothing, and I have already taken enough from you. Marin stood in the doorway for a long moment. You did it again, she said. He shut his eyes. You decided. By yourself, in the dark. What I could be told and what I could bear. And you did it out of love, and you did it exactly the way you did it last time, and last time, it cost me my entire life. Her voice was shaking. You have never once trusted me with the truth, when the truth was expensive. You will die for me. You simply will not tell me anything. She turned and walked out into the corridor. Marin, he said behind her, please, I need you. She stopped. She stood with her back to him in that cold hallway, and she waited. With the whole of her, for the other words, for the ones that cost something, for I am sorry, or I was wrong, or I should have said your name. I need you, he said again. Marin Vale went back to her husband's bedside, and did not speak to him again that night. Bevanlock found her at 4 in the morning in the corridor outside Ansel's chamber, sitting on a bench with her head in her hands. Oh, child, he said. And Marin, who was a queen, and the most dangerous mind in that palace, felt the whole of her 11-year-old self stand up inside her and want to be held. He sat down beside her. He did not touch her. He simply sat with his hands on his knees, the way he had sat beside her 100 times when she was small and could not sleep, and after a while she found she was crying, and she let him see it. He is not going to live, she said. No. I do not think he is. They are saying apoplexy. They are saying what they have been told to say. He sighed, long and weary and grieving. Marin, I have been trying all night to find a way to spare you this, and there is not one, so I will say it, and you may hate me for it, afterwards. She lifted her head. It was the king, said Bevanlock. She said nothing. Quote, I have made it my business to see every cup poured in this palace since his father died. And an hour before the oath, I found him alone at the sideboard in the long gallery, where he had no business being, and he told me he was looking for a window. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eye. I have spent 7 hours telling myself that a boy I raised could not possibly. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eye. He wants you, Marin. He has wanted you since the day he first saw you, and he has never in his life been told no. And there was one man standing between him and what he wanted. And now that man is dying in that room. Corvin would not, she whispered. He would tell you he would not. He loves me. Yes, said Bevan, and that is precisely what frightens me. Marin wiped her face with the back of her wrist. What did he use? And Bevan Locke, gently, kindly, with 20 years of love in his voice, said, wolf-spined. Child, there was wolf-spined in the cup. The corridor went absolutely silent. She had spent 9 years learning to keep her face exactly where it was, while she read a forged seal, and she did it now. And the world reorganized itself around her like a room when the lamp is finally lit, wolf-spined. She had learned the word 10 days ago out of a Solanese herbal. She had said it aloud to exactly one living person in the ruin of a burned archive at midnight, with no other soul within 100 paces. There was no wolf-spined in Ansel's cup. She had stood over the physician and watched him name what was in her husband's mouth, and it was Ravensfoot, and it was Gallwort, and neither of them dulls anything. They kill. There was only one man alive who could look at a dying king and reach for the word wolf-spined, and that was the man who had been feeding it to an alpha king in a cup of black tea every evening for 9 years. He had reached for the one word that would land on her, because he did not know that she already knew. Bevan Locke had made exactly one mistake in 20 years, and it was going to be enough. Marin, he said softly, child, look at me. She looked at him, and she let her face come apart, exactly the way an 11-year-old girl's face comes apart, because he had taught her what that looked like, and she gave it back to him now, with everything she had. What do we do? She whispered, and she watched, with a clarity so cold it was almost peaceful, the flicker of satisfaction go across the face of the man who had raised her. We go to the Solanese lords, said Bevan Locke. Before he can arrange the story, their king is dying under a Vardenhold roof, poisoned by a Vardenhold hand, and the only witness with a crown on her head is his own wife. He took her hands in both of his. You will tell them what you saw. They will believe nobody else on this earth. And then a king who murders his guests cannot sit on that throne, and the great houses will need someone steady to hold the north while the dust settles. There are good names ready. Ostmere among them. Marin nodded. At dawn, she said. At dawn, Bevan agreed. And he stood, and he put his hand on her shoulder, the way he had when she was 11, and Marin Vale sat perfectly still underneath it and let him. By dawn there were 40 Solanese swords in the great hall of Vardenhold, and no way for this to end without a war. They had put Corvin on the floor of his own hall. Not in irons, because no man in that room was willing to be the one who laid hands on an alpha king, but they had taken his sword and put a ring of steel around him, and he stood in the middle of it and did not look at the swords. He was looking at the door. Marin came through it, with Bevan Locke at her right hand. The whole hall turned. The Solanese lords, grey with grief and fury, leaned forward. The great houses of Vardenhold, who had watched her walk out of this room in grey wool a year ago, understood that the clerk had come back to bury their king. Lady Senate of Ostmere touched her mouth to hide what was on it, and Corvin, he was not afraid. That was the thing that nearly broke her. He stood in a ring of foreign steel, and watched the only woman he had ever loved walk in to condemn him, and what was on his face was not fear, it was permission. Do it, said his face. If it saves you, do it, and I will not say one word. You, impossible man, she thought. My lords, said Bevan Locke. Her Majesty of Selene will tell you what she saw. Marin walked into the middle of that hall. She had walked this floor before, with an empty fist and 200 people watching her go. She walked it now in the other direction, and she took her time. And when she reached the center, she did not turn to the Solanese lords. She turned to Bevan. Say the word again, she said. He blinked. Child. The word you said to me in the corridor at 4 this morning. The one you used for the poison in my husband's cup. Say it to the room." There was a pause of half a heartbeat, and in it, Marin watched a man who had never in 20 years been caught out arrive at the edge of the map. "Wolfspined," said Bevan Locke. Louder. "Wolfspined? And I do not know what game you are playing, but your husband is dying." "He is dying," Marin agreed. "Of raven's foot and gallwort, which is what the Solanese physician named at midnight, and which any surgeon here may confirm for himself." She turned to the room. "There was no wolfspine in that cup. Wolfspine is not a poison. It does not kill. It is a dulling agent used on captured alphas in the old wars. It takes months of daily dosing to build in the blood, and precisely 2 people in this kingdom have spoken that word aloud in 9 years. She looked at Bevan. "I am one," she said. "You are the other, and I only learned it 10 days ago." The silence in that hall had a floor to it. "Search his chambers," said Marin. "This is grief," said Bevan Locke, and his voice was still beautiful and still warm, and it was working on the room. She could feel it working. "My lords, she has sat all night with a dying man. She is not herself." "Search his chambers," Marin said again, "and bring me the Northern March ledger from the 3rd shelf, and set it beside the Crown Store ledger from the Treasury, which has never in 9 years stood in the same room as it, because only one man has ever held both keys." Bevan's hand moved. He was 70 years old, and he was faster than any of them. And he did not go for a blade, because Bevan Locke had never in his life needed a blade. He went for the fire. There was a brazier, burning by the dais, against the cold of the morning, and he reached it with a sheaf of papers he had carried under his arm since 4 o'clock, and had never once put down, and he had them in the coals before a single Solanese sword cleared its scabbard. The flames went up green and greedy. Bevan Locke stood over the brazier and watched 9 years of ledger entries curl and blacken, and he began, quietly, to laugh. Marin walked over and stood beside him. "Bevan," she said. He looked at her, and the warmth was gone. Out of his face, and what was underneath it was nothing at all. "You cannot prove a word of it now," he said. "You taught me to read," said Marin Vale. She pulled a folded sheaf of paper from the front of her gown, and held it up so the whole hall could see it, and her hand did not shake. "When I was 13 years old," she said, "you stood behind me in that archive, and told me that a document which exists in one place does not exist at all. That fire and water and mice and men take everything in the end, and the only true copy of anything is the copy nobody knows you have made." Her voice carried to the back of the hall. "I carried the Northern March out through a coal chute in my arms, the night you burned my archive, and I copied it before dawn. I copied the Border Post ledger 3 weeks ago. And I sent a second copy of both south with a rider, the day I understood what you had done, and it is sitting in the treasury of Selene, and there is nothing you can burn in this room that is worth anything at all." She let the paper fall open. "You were the best teacher I ever had," she said. "You should have remembered what you taught me." Bevan Locke looked at her for a long moment. Then he lunged. He did not lunge at her. She had half expected it, and she was braced for it, and it never came, because he was not a fool, and there was only one thing left in that room that could still save him. He went for the brazier again, for the last unburned corner, and Halvard of the Vardenhold Guard put him face down on the flagstones before his hand reached the coals, and it was over. They dragged him out. He did not shout. He went with his head up, the way a man goes who has decided that dignity is the only property he has left, and at the door, he looked back once, and Marin made herself hold his eyes until he was gone. Then the hall came apart into noise. The Solanese swords went down, and Marin stood in the middle of the floor with her copies in her hand and could not, for a moment, remember how legs worked. Corvin came through the crowd. He did not touch her. He looked at her the way a man looks at the sun coming up over a country he thought he would never see again. "There is one more thing," said Marin, "and then I am going to be sick." She turned to the hall and raised her voice. "Your king has been drinking wolfspine in his tea every evening since he was 19 years old," she said. "The Lord Chancellor poured it. A year ago, in this room, That man asked your king a question about a bond that he had spent 7 years making certain your king could not feel. The hall made a low, ugly, rising sound. He was drugged, Marin said. He was drugged when he sat in that chair and could not speak. Whatever you have thought of him for a year, you may put it down now. And the Alpha King of Vardenhold said, clearly into the silence. No, Marin turned. No, he said again to the whole hall. It is true, and it changes nothing. There was a woman standing on that floor, with her whole heart in her hands, and she was mine, and I knew it, drug or no drug, and I could have said her name, and I did not. He looked at her, and only at her. I was afraid. That is not a poison, that is a man. And I will not stand in front of this kingdom and be forgiven for the one thing I have actually done. The hall did not make a sound. Marin looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked past him, out of the great hall of Vardenhold, and back to her husband's room. Ansel of Selene did not die. He came back slowly, and badly, and in the wrong order. The words returned before the strength did, so that for 2 weeks, she had a king who could argue about the grain tithe and could not lift a cup, which he said was the natural condition of kings, and simply more honest. She sat with him every day. On the 9th, he told her the truth. I need you to listen, he said. And I need you not to be kind about it, Marin. Why do you think I married you? Because I know where things live. Because there was a warrant, said Ansel. She went very still. It came south, 3 months after you did. Not from the king. From the chancellor, in the chancellor's hand, under his own seal, demanding the return of a Vardenhold subject wanted for the fabrication of a bond and the theft of state papers. He watched her carefully. It was a death warrant with good manners on it, and I could not refuse it. Not for a clerk. Marin's mouth had gone dry. But I could refuse it, said Ansel. For a queen. The room was very quiet, so I married you. In the small chapel, with 2 witnesses and a contract that is in my strongbox, and that you have never read. And it says this marriage is a shield, and nothing else, and that either of us may end it at any hour by saying so. He shrugged, and it clearly hurt him. I have never asked anything of you but your counsel. You have given me a treaty that will feed my northern march for 50 years. You have paid for that crown 4 times over, and now I am giving it back, Ansel. You are the finest mind I have ever had at my table, he said, and you are not in love with me, and I have known that since the guardhouse, and I am not such a small man that I will take a life in payment for a kindness. He closed his eyes. Go home, Marin. That is not my home. Yes, said Ansel of Selene. It is so. She was free. She had expected it to feel like a door opening. Instead, it felt like standing in an open field with no walls anywhere and no idea which direction was north. And Marin Vale, who had spent her whole life being handed her circumstances by other people, discovered that being handed her freedom was not the same thing as choosing. She did not go to Corvin. She stayed in Vardenhold through the autumn, because there was a kingdom to unrob and nobody else could read the books. She sat at the council. She rewrote the tithe. She sent the seed grain north with an escort of her own choosing, and stood in the rain and watched it go into the ground. And every day, in that palace, she and the king of Vardenhold were unfailingly, exquisitely, murderously polite to one another. He wrote to her. He did not speak to her about it, not once, because she had told him in the ash that he had never trusted her with an expensive truth, and he had evidently decided to spend the rest of his life proving her wrong on paper. The letters came 2 and 3 a week, in his own hand, and they were not pleading. Some were about the tithe, some were questions about the northern roads, real ones, the kind a man asks when he wants the answer. I have stopped taking the tea, said one. Halvard tastes everything now, and complains bitterly. I can hear my own wolf again. He is furious with me, and he is right. And one, near the bottom of a long page, she had sworn she would not finish. You said I have never trusted you with the truth, when the truth was expensive. It is the truest thing anybody has ever said about me, and I did not enjoy learning it from the one person I did not want to be right. I am not asking to be forgiven. I would not know what to do with it. I am asking to be allowed to keep telling you things. Nessa had opinions. He is groveling, she said with satisfaction. Let him grovel until his knees go through. By the 5th month, the line had moved. He rebuilt your archive, said Nessa, folding linen with unnecessary violence. Exactly as it was, with a lock that opens to nobody but you, and he has never once mentioned it, and you walk past it every day, like it is a wall. You are the cleverest woman in the north, and you are being extremely stupid, and everybody in this palace has to stand here and watch Marin put down her pen. He decided for me, twice. Both times he was protecting me, and both times it cost me a year of my life. If I go back to him now, what he learns is that it works. And what do you learn? Marin did not answer that. In the 6th month, a letter came that was different. Marin, I have been counting, which is not like me. This is the 61st. I have been telling myself I am not asking you for anything, and that is not true, and you of all people should not be lied to twice. I am asking. I have been asking since the day you walked back through my door, and I have been dressing it up as roads and grain, because I did not have the courage to say it plainly, and you have known that, and you have been kind enough not to say so. So here it is, plainly, I want you. I have wanted you every hour of 2 years. And I have finally understood that a man who says he is not asking, while asking, is doing the thing I have always done, which is to make your choice for you without letting you see me do it. You have spent your whole life having your circumstances handed to you. I will not be another one. So I am going to stop. Not because I have stopped wanting you. Because you cannot choose a thing that is standing in your doorway with its foot in the door, and I would rather lose you, honestly, than keep you by refusing to go away. The archive is yours, whatever you decide. So is the seat at the council. So is the north. I will not write again. Corvan. She read it twice. She sat at her table in the rebuilt archive, in the smell of new timber, with 61 letters in the drawer beside her hand, and waited to feel relieved. He kept his word. That was the unbearable part. No letters, no flowers. When they passed in a corridor, he stood aside and inclined his head and said, "My lady," in a voice that was even and warm and entirely without hope, and he never once looked back, and Marin went to her chamber that first week and found she could not sit down. She lasted 9 days. On the 9th, she came out of the archive at dusk and stood in the yard, and the first snow of the year was coming down on Vardenhold, and she put her hand flat on her sternum over the door she had shut with a collar pin 2 years ago, and had never once in all that time opened of her own free will. You cannot choose a thing that is standing in your doorway. "Oh," said Marin Vale, out loud, to nobody at all. "Oh, you clever, clever man." The great hall of Vardenhold was full, because it was the first council of the winter and every noble house in the north had come in out of the snow. Marin walked in through the tall doors. They made that low grinding sound, like a stone rolled off a tomb, and she heard it, and she thought about the last 2 times she had heard it, and found that her hands were perfectly steady. 200 faces turned. She had worn gray. Not the gray of a clerk, just gray, plain and warm, and hers, with no crown on her head, because she had sent the crown of Selene south, with the treaty, and had not replaced it. At the top of the dais, the Alpha King of Vardenhold stood up. She saw him understand that something was happening, and not know what. And she saw him do the thing he had promised her he would do, which was to say nothing, and wait, and leave the whole width of that hall for her to cross or not cross exactly as she chose. Marin crossed it. Past the great houses, past Lady Senate of Ostmere, past the flagstone where a small tarnished pin had once rung and rolled and stopped, and she did not hurry, and nobody in that hall breathed. She stopped at the foot of the dais. "My lords," she said, "I am going to ask the king a question, and I am afraid you are all going to have to listen to the answer." 2 years ago," said Marin, "I stood on this floor, and a man asked your king whether I was his mate, and your king said nothing, and I cut the bond in front of all of you, and I walked out of that door." She turned and looked at the room. "You watched. Not one of you said a word. I have never held it against you, because I would not have said a word either. That is what a court is. She turned back. Corvin Dre had not moved. He was gripping the arm of his father's chair. She saw it, and she recognized it, and her heart went over. I am going to give you the thing you never got, she said. And Marin Vale went down onto the first step of the dais, and she held out her hand, palm up, and open, and empty. Freely made, she said. The hall made no sound at all. I take back the taking back, said Marin. And her voice cracked, and she did not care. And I am asking you out loud in front of every soul in this kingdom, where nobody can say afterwards that it was hidden, because I have had enough of decisions made for me in the dark by men who love me. So decide it here in the light, with me watching. She lifted her chin. Corvin Dre, am I your mate? Corvin came down off the dais so fast that two of the guard reached for their swords. He stopped in front of her. And then he reached into his coat and took out a small tarnished pin, the pin of an archivist of Vardenhold, and he laid it in her open palm and closed her fingers around it, and when he lifted his head his eyes were wet, and he did not appear to have noticed. I picked it up off that floor, he said, before the doors had finished closing. I have carried it every day for 2 years. I could not put it down. Yes, said Corvin Dre, and she opened the door. She had shut it with a pin in this room in front of these people, and she opened it now, with nothing at all, and it came through her like a river through a wall, and it was not grief this time, it was joy. Undefended, unstrategic, appalling joy, arriving all at once from the other side of a door that had stood open for 2 years, waiting for somebody to walk through it. Marin made a sound she was not proud of. The great hall of Vardenhold erupted. Wait, she said, into his chest, into the noise. Corvin, tell me what you said. He pulled back to look at her. When the doors closed. 2 years ago you stood up. I heard the chair. I heard you take a breath, and heard you begin. And then the doors shut, and I have wondered every day of my life, since what you were going to say. Corvin Dre laughed. It was a wet, wrecked, disbelieving laugh, and he pressed his forehead against hers. You never asked. I was too proud, Marin. He was still laughing. He was also quite openly crying. I said the only thing I had left to say, and I said it to a closed door in front of 200 people, and every one of them heard it, and not one of them ever told you, because they were all far too frightened of the man who wrote the warrant. Corvin, I said the Alpha King of Vardenhold, freely made. The floor went out from under her, I said freely made, and I do not take it back, and I have never taken it back for 1 hour of 1 day in 2 years. His hands were shaking against her face. That is why it never cut. That is why you were shut and not severed. A bond is a thing 2 people say yes to. I said yes. I said it 3 heartbeats too late, and I said it to a door, and I have been saying it every day since, into a room, with nobody in it. Marin Vale stood in the great hall of Vardenhold, with her palm open and her bond open, and 200 noble houses screaming, and could not get a single word out. Say something, said Corvin. Ask me again tomorrow, she said. He asked her the next day. He asked her at the council table until Halvard threatened, in writing, to resign. He asked her in the rebuilt archive with snow on his shoulders, and ink on his hands, and once in a field in the freezing rain, watching the winter wheat come up green out of ground that had been yellow for 9 years. She said, ask me tomorrow, every time, for 4 months, not to punish him. He understood that, and so did she, and Nessa did not, and said so at length. It was because Marin Vale had spent her whole life having her circumstances handed to her, and she had discovered there is an enormous difference between being chosen and choosing, and she meant to do it every day until the doing of it wore a groove. On an unremarkable morning in spring, over bread, with her hair unbrushed, and a tithe roll open beside her plate, he asked again, and Marin looked up at the man grinning hopefully at her across the table, and said, yes. They were married in the great hall. She wore gray. He cried during the vows, which surprised nobody. She did not, which surprised everybody, right up until the bond gave her away entirely. And the whole hall heard the Queen of Vardenhold laugh and sob at once, and he laughed at her through his own tears, and she stopped caring who saw. King Ansel of Selene came north for it, walking with a stick, and gave her away, and made a speech about the 11th article of the grain tithe that went on for some time. Bevanlock did not attend. He was in a cell beneath the old fort, where he was, by every report, extremely polite. "You are stuck with me," Corvin said afterwards, with his mouth against her hair. "I let you walk out of this room once. You did. I will not be doing it again." And Marin Vale, who had walked out of that hall with an empty fist and nothing to her name, put her hand flat against his chest, over the door that had never once closed, and said, "No, I do not believe you will."